All right, so welcome everyone. I am Bertrand de la Chapelle. I'm the Executive Director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, which has a certain number of activities, and one of them is a contact group regarding the questions of DNS abuse. We have the pleasure of having around this table 4 members of this contact group to discuss one of the key questions that we have addressed this year, which is how to improve the workflow of fighting botnets. And this is a framing brief that will be circulated in the chat during the call. The Domains and Jurisdiction Program and the contact group has been operating now for almost 5 years, and has produced a certain number of documents and outcomes that are accessible on the website of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. And one of the focus of the work during those years has been particularly on the questions of defining better the notion of DNS abuse, identifying when it is appropriate to act at the level of the DNS to address abuses online, because in general, intervening at the level of the DNS is not the natural tool to address abuses online, and a particular focus on what was described and defined as technical abuse as opposed to content-related abuse, which is mostly phishing, malware, botnets, as we will discuss today, spam, and other things of the same nature, where the intervention of DNS operators are potentially important and useful in remediating those attacks or these abuses. We have produced a certain number of things, including an extensive toolkit looking at the workflow of addressing DNS abuse, and I encourage you very strongly to look at these documents. But the one that we are going to discuss today is, as I mentioned, about improving the workflow of fighting botnets. A brief recap of why this is an important issue and why it is important to do this. As you know, botnets is basically a network of computers that have been infected by malware on behalf of a controlling entity, which will later use this network, sometimes massive networks, thousands of computers that are under control, to perpetrate abuses such as massive sending of spam or phishing, or denial of service attacks. And one important element that we are putting front and center here is something that is probably less known in the general public and the general environment, which is the use of domain-generating algorithms. And these domain-generating algorithms, or DGAs, are pieces of code that basically, on purpose and through a certain number of triggers, create or spin out domain names that are then registered to serve as control points or rendezvous points for the management of the botnet. And the important thing about those algorithms is that they can generate an enormous amount of domain names, including in a large number of registries, to have a chance of making sure that the control can be exercised. The end result is that those DGAs produce the counterpart, which is algorithmically generated domains, which can be very numerous. And one of the key challenges is that, as we will explain, there are a certain number of impediments in dealing with this massive amount of domains that are registered and that can help control a botnet. And the impediment is mostly about the speed of capacity to react and the coordination mechanisms between the different actors that are involved, including law enforcement, operators, and other actors. And so this document is called a framing brief, and it is intended to address the cooperation challenges and the technical challenges sometimes that arise when the different actors want to remediate botnets, and particularly algorithmically generated domains. And the structure of the document, before we get into a discussion with the speakers who have kindly accepted to be with us, the document is organized in 3 parts. One, there is a description of what are the current mechanisms, the current approaches, and what are the limitations of this current approach, both technically and operationally. The second part is to look at 2 potential avenues for moving forward that could be explored to improve marginally but significantly the way forward. And the third element is more prospective and lists a certain number of issues that would deserve a serious further discussion beyond just a recommendation, but just an additional discussion. So I'll go very quickly on these points before we open the discussion. Regarding the current approach, there is a huge challenge, first because of the amount of legal procedures that are necessary. There is a need, without getting into details, but there is a need sometimes because this involves an interaction between law enforcement and operators that are often not located in the same country. This involves an enormous amount of obtaining orders by courts, of using sometimes mutual legal assistance treaties that are pretty heavy and procedurally heavy to obtain the execution of those decisions by operators that are in another country. And this is a massive challenge of coordination and also a massive challenge of the amount of work that is needed, which is completely in contradiction with the need to operate very swiftly. And one thing that is important that I should have mentioned is that the reason why it is possible to act on those algorithmically generated domains is that sometimes, fortunately, law enforcement and other technical actors manage to crack the algorithm to preemptively generate the domains and be able to act upon them before they are used as control mechanism. So the legal procedures are already very heavy. And we will discuss that a little bit further, maybe. The second thing is that the rules of ICANN require that when an operator wants to register on its own a domain name, it has to go, it is forbidden by the agreements of ICANN on a general basis so that they don't do front running. But it requires them that they use a procedure called Expedited Registry Security Requests, ERSR, which means that the operator, upon notification that there is a domain that has been generated by an algorithm that can be used to organize a botnet, the operator needs to go to ICANN and formally request the authorization to register this domain and waive the fee that the operator is supposed to pay for to ICANN when registering a domain. This is a cumbersome procedure that has been alleviated a little bit, and ICANN has made a significant effort, apparently, in the last few years to make this process a little bit more fluid, but it's still an ad hoc, case-by-case procedure, theoretically, that needs to take place. The third element is the lack of transnational coordination. What is needed here is a massive, at scale, cooperation between a lot of actors. And I remember that, for instance, on a study that we did for Center around the Avalanche, dealing with the Avalanche botnet, more than 30 mutual legal assistance treaty decisions had to be put in place, which involves a lot of coordination between a large number of our actors. And so at the moment, there is no central process that basically verifies and validates for everyone that this is indeed a botnet, that there is a slew of domains that have been generated and that should be registered. And everything has to be done mostly, not completely, but mostly ad hoc on a case-by-case basis whenever there's a new botnet that arises. The second part, as I said, are the potential avenues moving forward. There are 2 avenues that we've identified in the group. The first one is introducing a distinction between disabling and studying the botnet. Disabling the use of a domain name that has been generated by an algorithm is simply, for instance, reserving the domain, and it prevents the domain from being used, doesn't necessarily force the creation of the domain itself. But if you want to study the botnet, you need to use, at least for a portion of those domains, what is called sinkholing, i.e. redirecting the domain to another, for instance, the registrar of last resort, so that the activity of the botnet can be studied. And in order to do so, you need to register the domain, because you cannot do simply reserve and prevent the resolution of the domain. So these two avenues are a first exploration where you can imagine a mechanism where the disabling takes place first, and the sinkholing may take place a little bit later or only for a portion of the domains that are being produced. The second suggestion is that there is a concept of evergreens. Evergreens are mechanisms that exist in court decisions when there is a likelihood that additional measures will have to be taken for exactly the same purpose on the basis of new information. And in that case, the idea is to explore whether court orders could more systematically adopt something that has been explored in certain cases, which is to say, here's the botnet, here's the evidence, this is why there's a need to address the domains that we have at the moment. But if there is an additional range of domains that have been identified later, it can be based on the same order with just a simpler update. And in this regard, there is a potential approach that this notion of evergreens could be used also within the discussion within ICANN, so that there would be mechanisms to grant the capacity to operators upon the provision of a sufficient demonstration of the existence of a botnet, a sort of proactive or ex ante authorization to do the necessary remediation with or without notification afterwards of the measures that have been taken. So the idea is to alleviate the burden of the ERSRs and continue on the path that has been already explored to a certain extent. Finally, 4 elements quickly for further discussions. One is, when there is an emergency, the coordination takes time. And there is a question of whether it would be interesting to explore a standing mechanism that organizes the procedures, that draws lessons from the fighting of previous botnets, to have the capacity to set up on an ad hoc basis emergency response action teams, but on the basis of an ongoing cooperation that would provide guidelines and procedures and mechanisms that are much more predictable. You can see more on this in the document itself. The other thing is that for the moment, we've talked about ICANN, but of course, ICANN has interactions of a certain kind with GTLDs, the global top-level domains, the generic top-level domains, but CCTLD, the country code top-level domains, are under a slightly different regime because they are mostly under the jurisdiction of their own country of incorporation. And one of the things that is explored here is to look at the interaction between CCTLDs and the local certs to improve the coordination and the mechanism for dealing with those botnets in an efficient manner. And also potentially looking at how the anti-abuse policies of the CCTLD operators can incorporate some provisions regarding how they will deal with botnets. 2 final elements, one that we will probably elaborate a little bit with Maciej later, is the question of name collision, because in as much as most of the algorithmically generated domains are new domains, sometimes gibberish, that have not been registered. Sometimes they also use domains that are already registered. And here there's a fundamental question. Are those domains registered because an innocent person had registered it and it has been compromised? Or has it been reserved in advance by malicious actors? And there are a lot of potential consequences if you disable or sinkhole a perfectly legitimate domain, and that adds a significant higher threshold for action. And finally, for discussion, there is a huge tension around the notion of secrecy, because all the procedures needed to deal with botnets require a high level of secrecy in the interactions. And this is in contradiction with the high level of coordination that is needed. And so there is a key question regarding how the operational mechanisms for coordination can handle this question of secrecy in a way that preserves the confidentiality and improves the efficiency at the same time. So this is the document that you can download from the website, and I think that Natalia or Julia have put it in the chat. And so it's my pleasure now to move to the to the four people who have kindly accepted to participate in this webinar, and they are all participants in the contact group. I will introduce them very briefly, and then we will go through the three dimensions that I've mentioned from the document. So Alan Woods is a barrister from Ireland. He's been working for many years, more than 8 years, in the DNS industry, and he's currently the Director of Compliance and Policy for Identity Digital, which is the new name of formerly Donuts and the merger with Affiliates. And he has also many responsibilities, I will not elaborate on all of them, in the environment of ICANN, particularly in the registry stakeholder group. Peter van Rost is the general manager of CENTER, the European Country Code Top-Level Domain Association. He was previously working as European government relations for eBay, and he's also has served as president previously of ISPA Belgium and Euro ISPA, and is also a member of the IETF LLC board. Rowena Shu is the Director of Programs and Policy at the DNS Abuse Institute, a new structure that we're extremely happy to have helped propel to existence to a certain extent through the work we've done. And prior to joining the Institute, she worked at various positions in the UK government at Ofcom, the UK's communication regulator, for the UK government at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and also at Nominet, the UK CCTLD. And finally, Maciej Kosinski is an associate professor of cybersecurity at Grenoble Institute of Technology in France, and is also the co-founder of Core Labs, which is a university spin-off dedicated to combating cyber threats. Among his various competencies, he has co-authored more than 30 research papers on the types of issues regarding DNS abuse and security on the DNS, on the basis of the work that we're doing here. So I will start, as I said, going through the three dimensions. First of all, a little bit more elaboration on the current approach and its limitations. And maybe I will start with you, Maciej. If you can give a general landscape of the importance of this problem, not only the importance of why it is important, but how big it is.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. The question that there also was like, what are some of the key challenges in remediating DGAs? So the key challenge, one of the first challenges is reverse engineering the actual malware samples. So we need to really have researchers. Fortunately, there is quite a big community that reverse engineers malware samples, and they reverse engineer DGA algorithms. And thanks to this, we can actually predict the domains that would be used to make the reliable communication between the compromised host and the bot master. So also just a brief thing that I'm discussing it more from the technical also point of view. So the second thing, once we have all the domains that can potentially be used by the attacker, there is a problem that the key challenge is coordination, as you mentioned already, and scale of the problem. So from the technical perspective, the DGA might lead to a generation of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of domains potentially, while for the operation of the botnet and ensuring this reliable communication between the compromised host and the bot master and the command and control server, we just need theoretically one. So imagine that a lot of TLD registries, they put a lot of effort in blocking, for example, unregistered domain names and preventing them from registration. And somewhere there are other TLDs in other jurisdictions, TLD operators, that unfortunately did not manage to block them. So really there is like big effort from the community and still the botnet can be operational. The third thing is scale, of course. For one malware family, we can have like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands domain names. And the question, of course, how should we mitigate them? Should we disable them? Should we reserve them? Should we sinkhole them? Also extremely important is the timing. Very often those domains, algorithmically generated domain names, they have so-called validity period, meaning that during a certain amount of time, for example, 1 day, 1 week, the compromised machines will be trying to contact them or use them to contact the actual command and control server. So we really need to make some actions before the actual validity period. And the last thing that I have on my list here is the type of action that I'm going to discuss a little bit later. But then what do we do? Do we reserve those domain names or do we sinkhole them? How many domains we should sinkhole? For how long we should reserve for those domains? And the last thing, also extremely important, where the domain names, the DGA domain names are already registered, the question of name collisions, as you mentioned, and we will elaborate a little bit later. But the idea here is, what do we do? Do we block those domains? Do we seize those domains or not? Because they might be registered by legitimate users, and by accident they collide with DGA domains. So those are, I would say, the key challenges that from the technical perspective.
Thank you so much, Maciej. And just I remember during one of the discussions in the contact group, there was a clear comment regarding the fact that we're in a technical arms race between the people who develop those instruments and the technicians who are trying to decode them on the other side, including a race on size, which is making the problem even more difficult. Thank you so much. Let me shift now to both Alan and Peter on this distinction of the situation for, on the one hand, GTLDs and on the other hand, CCTLDs. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And maybe I'll start with Alan.
Sure, thank you very much. And again, thank you also for the introduction. Yeah, I mean, from the generic TLD point of view, I mean, the obvious challenge that we have, and that would make us very distinct from our colleagues in the CCTLD, is the ICANN influence within that, and the fact that we are creatures of the contract when it comes to the GTLDs. And when it comes to the DGA, and as Maciej has said, and Bertrand, as you've talked about at the beginning, depending on how a particular DGA is going to be approached, we need to approach that with ICANN specifically as well. So is it going to be perhaps blocking of those domain names, the registration of them, or is it going to be the deletion of them, Or is it the transfer and the sync calling of those domains? And each one of them does trigger a different consideration within our contracts with ICANN, which then leads to the request for the expedited registry security request that you talked about earlier as well. So there is definitely those limitations in how we approach that, and there is definite opportunity for them to be streamlined. But part of that streamlining is a better understanding, and again, those keywords that you were talking about were, you know, things like coordination and knowing exactly what the DGA is composed of and how can we play our role as a registry. Other two very quick ones, I suppose, that are important for us will be the question of jurisdiction. You've already talked about this in your intro as well, and that is important for us because, again, the GTLD registries also are spread across the world. So making sure that we can ensure that the proper jurisdiction is applied where we require court orders for certain instances. And then lastly is just about the clarity and the ask of what a registry is being asked from, you know, coming from, you know, a relatively large now registry where we have some legacy TLDs. I mean, I've just gone through a process of trying to clean up like over 200,000 domains that were registered, but 8 years old, where, you know, talking about the validity period of that DGA is long gone, but we're still holding on to 200,000 domains, or even reserved lists where we're finding that we have 100,000 reserved for something which we don't know when it should end. So getting that clarity kind of is the current challenges for me from a GTLD point of view.
Thank you so much. I love the expression "we are creatures of the contract," but I like the also the emphasis on the question of what happens after, because the remediation is an important thing, the action is an important thing, but what is the follow-up? Well, how long should they be kept is a question that needs to be discussed. Peter, CCTLD perspective. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Bertrand. It is a difficult problem to observe for us because those that have already collaborated with law enforcement agencies in previous exercises to address this problem and tackle the botnet are quite often under an obligation not to share any details about it. And those who have not been involved seem to think that there is no problem because nobody ever told them anything. So when we as an organization for European CCTLDs poke our members to give us feedback on what their previous experiences were and what the main problems was, there is a lot of ifs and hypothetical words used in the sentences, but nonetheless there is a pretty clear picture. On the good side, there is no ICANN, so we do not have the problem of having to have a third party sign off on any decision that are made. On the list of obstacles that members that have cooperated in the past, and Bertrand, you already mentioned Avalanche, required a lot of European CCTLDs collaborated successfully with their local law enforcement agencies. But all of them flagged the issue of the jurisdiction. In some countries is pretty clear. It's even prescribed in CCTLD specific legislation. I'm thinking of Norway and Switzerland, where it's simply not possible to accept any instruction from an authority that is not a recognized legal authority in the jurisdiction itself. So how have previous efforts been successful? Typically because they're based on trust-based relations. And as the paper explains a bit more in detail, that is typically with their national certs. There are MOUs and cooperation agreements for those CCTLDs that are part of the government. These are often captured in regulations that allow this sort of interaction between those entities, and that is for them for sure a direct way to be helpful in this matter. However, that is probably less than half of the CCTLDs that will benefit from that. Validity period, as flagged by Alan, follow-up. I think there's still quite a few questions on the follow-up from Avalanche. Again, I think we're talking about a couple of 100,000 domains across Europe. And then the last point is also related to those numbers, and that is that quite a few members in those discussions have flagged their concern with regards to scalability. It was in 2020 probably that a request which was processed to a smaller CCTLD, European CCTLD, was about 180,000 names. That is about the total size of that CCTLD zone file. So that gives a clear perspective on what a big impact this could have. And in that context, it's worth noting that the current gibberish domains that are typically being used by those algorithms might not be gibberish forever. And then the problem of conflicting and overlapping names and data sets might become a significant one. So that is the current situation for CCTLDs. So far, successful cooperation, but it has been quite tricky to make these a success in the past.
Thank you very much for those points, particularly the one about the challenges of secrecy that we have mentioned already, and the last point that you made, which is that depending on the size of the CCTLDs, in particular, the ones that are smaller than most GTLDs, the number of domains that have to be registered is in completely different proportion to what a company or a registry like like Identity Digital or VeriSign or others may be confronted with. Thank you. Finishing on this notion of the current approaches and the limitations, Rowena, when you look at your dual experience of having been in Nominet, one CCTLD, and now in the DNS Abuse Institute, how do you see this this issue, and particularly the question of the cooperation between the public actors and the private actors, and the role of the operators in that regard?
Thanks, Prashant. And I do fear that I might be at risk of repeating some of the excellent points made by all our other excellent speakers here today, but I'll do my best. So I think we've talked a little bit already about some of the ICANN policies that can create difficulties in the GTLD space. And I think when you look at CCTLDs, you start to get different problems depending on where they are. Certainly in my experience previously at Nominet, we weren't obstructed by certain parts of ICANN policies, in the sense that we didn't have restrictions around being able to register domain names directly for a law enforcement or a cert, and we didn't have to seek this expedited registry security request. But in .uk, we had very, very few reserved names. That was not something that we did a lot in that registry. So usually that meant the mitigation we were looking at was around registering a domain name to a relevant law enforcement authority or national cert, which spins up a whole other bunch of questions in terms of who is it going to be registered to, how long is it going to be registered, and making sure that whoever is in control of that is the right person to monitor the ongoing threat and make a decision at which point that name should cease to be registered, which sort of ties back to some of the other points people had made about, are we just going to take these out of circulation forever? How long do they stay out of circulation? If it's a big, long, random name that no one wants to use for anything else, maybe that's not as much of an issue. But if it starts to become names that would be otherwise valuable for people to use legitimately, it all starts to become a little bit more complicated. Yeah, and perhaps I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I think the question of the volume and the follow-up has popped up several times, and I think it's something that maybe deserves a lot of attention. So if I move forward to the second part about the potential avenues for moving forward, and I was mentioning the two things regarding ERSRs and the difference between disabling and studying botnets. Alan, can you elaborate a little bit on how the evolution has been on the ERSR within ICANN? Because I understand, and we heard during the contact group, that there has been some flexibility already put in place. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely, thank you very much. And yeah, indeed, actually, the concept of the ERSR, the evergreen ERSR, was actually something I heard first within the contact group at the I&J from, I think, with Brian Symbolic at the time. And yeah, I mean, from what is, again, it's a contractual mechanism in order to request that you have temporary immunity from compliance, in effect, for certain elements. You had to always provide a lot of details about the specifics of the action you were trying to take, what sections of the contract you're trying to get a temporary immunity from. And it used to be cumbersome, and it used to delay matters because we had to put that in place in order to get the actions to be done. Now, with ICANN and how they've evolved, because obviously, you know, as the more of these things occur, the more lessons are learned in these matters, and specifically the concept of the evergreen, as opposed to, you know, as opposed to going to ICANN and saying we have this set list or number of lists, we can say this is a concept of, this is what it looks like, this is the DGA we're talking about, these are the initiating aspects of this DGA and the requests from law enforcement, and say, can we make sure that this is extended to the life of this domain? So we don't have to keep going back to ICANN. Now, I can't say I've never actually had to do it myself just yet, but I've heard that they are very open to this. But I do think that it is still probably something which is theoretical and ad hoc, and that's definitely something that we can have more conversation about, fill out a little bit more flesh on that as well. One of the other, I suppose, evolutions that's important that I can have open arms on this as well, and that is that they've allowed retrospective application of the ERSR as well, which is another important thing, that when the time is an issue, we can get it done and then go back to ICANN, maybe just drop them an email and say, hey, we're doing this and we will submit the ERSR with regards to that. And they've, again, been very open to that for us as well. But again, it probably would benefit from us being able to come with a bit more meat on the bones of what that evergreen ERSR could look like, and have that conversation with all the stakeholders involved so that we can play our part again. I think it's that clarity that would be very important for us. So it is evolving, but it could evolve in probably a slightly more formal sense in order to help more people, not just the people involved in these conversations, but everybody within the GTLD space. I think we can be benefit of.
Yeah, the good thing is that at least it's evolving in the good direction that points toward the possibility to continue in this respect. Thank you. Maciej, I'm coming back to you now on this question of the different actions and the differences between sinkholing and disabling, and what is the proportion. And I want to re-emphasize what you said earlier, which may have been lost in the amount of information you were giving. The problem being that when you have hundreds of thousands of domains, if there is one that is still operational, it can still make the botnet function. I think this is something that is making this problem particularly difficult. So coming back to the question of disabling sinkholing, the types of action, DNS operators don't have an enormous portfolio of actions that are possible. What are the benefits and the challenges for both?
So thank you so much for the question. Yes, so I will come back to the example of Avalanche. So in the first iteration of Avalanche takedown, there were 800,000 algorithmically generated domain names, and the great majority of them were actually not registered. So what the operators could do with them? So they could definitely block them. So, for example, reserve them, so that the malicious actors cannot register them and cannot ensure the reliable communication between command and control and the compromised hosts. But once more, I will emphasize this, that there are like two problems. One problem is this coordination. If to really take down, to prevent botnet from being operational, we really need to collectively block those domains. If there is one registry operator that cannot block those domains for any reasons, then the botnet will be eventually operational. The second thing is the scalability. I think Peter discussed this, Rowena also, and also Alan. You have 100,000 domain names reserved, for example, and then what, right? And if I were an attacker, I would start generating millions of those domains per day. And then what? Fortunately, once more, as mentioned before, that the researchers, they reverse engineer those algorithms. They get not only the domain names themselves, but also the validity period. So those domains could be reserved during the validity period. The problem that there is another challenge. What if the validity period is infinity? That's a completely different and open question. So that's one thing. And second thing is sinkholing. So those domains that are maybe not registered, or some domains that are confirmed, that are registered and confirmed to be malicious, they could be seized and sinkholed. What does it mean, sinkholing? It means delegating the authority for a given domain name to, let's say, researchers, to, let's say, registrar of last resort, to law enforcement agencies. And thanks to this, we can study those botnets. And in particular, what is extremely important here is that it's not as easy, but still we can verify which compromised hosts are trying to connect to our server, and potentially estimate the size of the botnet and locate them, and, for example, issue send notifications to the operators of those networks, internet service providers, and initiate the cleanup of the entire of the actual end hosts. So, on one hand, we have disabling so blocking domains from registration, and that prevents, if coordinated and done at really large scale, it can prevent the communication between compromised hosts and the rendezvous point, so the operator of the botnet. On the other hand, we have sinkholing, and a couple of domains, I don't know how many, but some portion of the domains should be sinkholed. That prevents malicious actors from registering them, but also allows to estimate the size of the botnet and initiate other steps. So, for example, notifications to service operators where in their networks that there are compromised hosts that are located and being part of the botnet. So those are, I would say, two, as you mentioned, that there are limited options, and both of them are very important. And sinkholing is also extremely important here.
Well, I think the analogy, thank you, and the analogy that came to mind as you were speaking for the audience in general is the equivalent when you have somebody creating an attack or planning an attack on a terrorist attack somewhere. It's one thing to be able to remove, for instance, the engine or disable the engine that has been planted there in due time so that it doesn't explode. And it's a completely different thing to do the forensics to understand where did the planning come from, who is operating this this particular device, who planted it, and catching them to be able to prosecute afterwards. So this cat and mouse game is an ongoing one, and what we've been focusing here is on this distinction between preventing the thing from operating, and the second, particularly through sinkholing, being allowed to study the botnet afterwards and continue the investigations to prevent and prosecute the people behind. Thank you so much. I think this is painting an amazing picture, and unfortunately a very troublesome picture of the difficulty of working in this arms race. I want to finish with the few elements that we had and I had mentioned as elements for further consideration. Maybe I will stick with you, Maciej, at the moment to talk a little bit more about name collisions and what can be done about name collisions.
Yeah, so it's another very interesting and very challenging subject. Coming back to the Avalanche case and the first iteration, I mentioned we had 800,000 algorithmically generated domain names, and 1% of them were registered. So the question is, what the DNS service of the DNS, so TLD registries or potentially registrars could do about this? Should they simply block them, suspend them? Not necessarily, because those domains could collide those algorithmically generated domain names could collide with domain names of legitimate users. So we have a domain name that was algorithmically generated, but before there was a benign user that actually registered this domain name. So we cannot, an attacker cannot register it, but from the law enforcement perspective, we also, and from the TLD register operator, we would like to also prevent the collateral damage and taking down the domain names that belong to benign users. And of course, 1% of
yeah, it's still 8,000 domains.
Exactly, this is the point. And then those, from our experience, to the best of my knowledge, those domains in Avalanche takedown actions, they are semi-automatically or manually actually verified. So we also created an algorithm, a machine learning algorithm, to help with automatically classifying them, and we contributed to the one of the iterations of the Avalanche takedown in recent years. So also this is probably one of the things that if the community would like, if there is a need for such a tool, we could actually create such an automated tool to support law enforcement agencies. But also from the attacker's perspective once more. Because like if I were a smart attacker, I would create my DGA in a way that there are like a lot of collisions. Let's say 30% collisions, 50% of collisions, because still I need just one or couple of domains theoretically to make reliable communication. And by doing, by creating those collisions with already registered domain names, I would make as an attacker much harder, the life of investigators much harder in this context.
There's one thing I won't belabor on this, because the almost manual verification that something has been compromised is a massive task, especially if you go in the numbers we're talking about. I just want to mention that in the chat there are two questions that have emerged, one from Nigel and one from Tim. I think the question of Tim is very easy to answer, and I can do that in 1 second. The notion of the algorithmically generated domains is precisely when you crack the algorithm spits out the domains that are going to be generated at a particular period in time. So this is how they are identified, and this is how you can look at 800,000 or more domains. It's the algorithm is just basically revealing its inner bowels, if you see what I mean. But the other question, very quickly, Nigel said, would some of these 8,000 domains have important and relevant content? Could you elaborate, just at a small proportion, say which proportion of those domains already registered ended up being considered as compromised versus legitimately registered?
I do not have the numbers on the top of my head, unfortunately, but I know that for the Avalanche case that we contributed, there were like 3,000 legitimate domain names that were about to be taken down, and thanks to the algorithm, we labeled them differently, and they were not taken down. So those are the numbers that I can share with you, but have important and relevant content. I do not have the answer on the top of my head. Yeah,
but anyway, the question is that once again, you have, in using machine learning algorithms, you have the question of false positives and false negatives.
Absolutely.
On which direction do you tilt the balance?
Exactly.
Make sure that there's
Exactly.
not one that is dropped.
And
all right.
Yes.
I have, for the sake of time, I want to move to the next point. Thank you very much, Maciej. To come back to actually Peter, Rowena, and Alan on the question of how much could we explore the idea of a more structured emergency mechanism or structured cooperation that could be activated, a little bit like I mean, the analogy that comes to mind is you have things in the US called FEMA. When there is a catastrophe somewhere, they have a set of procedures. And when there's a specific problem, attack, or tornado, they have the procedures to put in place the emergency team. Is this an analogy that could work? Who is chiming in first? Rowena, Alan, or Peter?
I'm happy to go first, but I first would like to bring up something else, which for me in this whole discussion has often been the elephant in the room. With this debate, we're trying to fix a problem that goes way beyond the realm of possibility of where this industry can play a role, and that is the lacking cooperation tools between law enforcement agencies. We are coming up with a solution that has, in the best possible scenario, carries just the risk, not as a real impact, but the risk of bypassing regulatory procedures and due process.
And protections.
And that can infringe on countries' authority to set course for how they want to deal with another country's requests when it comes to notice and takedown or the takedown of these botnet domains. So I think it's very important to realize that at all points in this discussion that we're trying to come up with a fix for a problem that definitely is somewhere else and not in this industry. As for an coordinated effort, as I've and I think it's partially reflected in the paper as well, but we've been discussing this before. Coordination between certs is probably already an existing hub of good, sound, and trusted cooperation with an authority that stretches beyond our industry. And I think for most CCTLDs, that for sure would be the best place to start.
Thank you. Alan?
I might jump in. Yeah, I might jump in then. Sorry, Verena. Yeah, no, I completely agree with what Peter is saying there. I do think one of the other kind of difficulties, and I suppose speaking to my own experience as well, an awful lot of the difficulty for me is that a lawyer looking at things that are very technically minded, that is not necessarily the best mix either. So I think having a good evidence-based coordination where it brings in the expertise of people such as Matt or people, such as certs, to be able to have in that sort of identifying and, highlighting that there is a DJ here, but also being able to have those centralized points where secrecy is a lot easier to control. Number one, in those instances, they're not conversations in silos. And also just looking at simple things of having a knowledge base of where a registry is, what that registry requires. Is it requiring a court order? Is it not? Does it require an ERSR? And perhaps even, and not to be radical in this, but maybe to have ICANN as a party in that, where they could be ready with a ready-to-go ERSR. It's not a proactive request for an ERSR. There's one waiting already for those registries involved, a push of an ERSR where necessary. So having that in a coordination points, I think that there is definite benefit in discussing that. And it's all about reducing the time to live of these things, preventing the impact, whilst also enabling the studying and the ability for the people who are actually not lawyers here to actually prevent it from happening again, or for it from perpetuating. So I do think that there's a great amount of probably support for that concept. I certainly would be in for it.
Thank you, Alan. Rowena, do you want to add something? And maybe on one element that I see emerging in the discussion, and that we didn't emphasize probably enough in the document, which is the separation or the complementarity between the cooperation on collecting evidence and validating evidence regarding the existence of a botnet, the technical dimensions and what is really at stake. And the second dimension, which Peter alluded to, which is what are the procedures that are going to be in place to act upon this evidence. And I just wanted to insert this if you have also comments in that regard, but go ahead.
Thanks, Bertrand. Yes, there's certainly a very difficult situation here where we've got the operators of registrars and registries that kind of have this responsibility that's dispersed across the whole internet, and then we have this jurisdictional picture which doesn't necessarily match up perfectly, which can be a big challenge, and something that we talk about a lot in I&J. I think clearly there's a role around educating local law enforcement as to those complexities we've been talking about today, so that they understand what they need to ask for, or the avenues they need to take when they're trying to take international action against something. I think that can help a lot. There's also a question around how they get their reports to the right party. And I'm going to do a shameless plug for the work that we do at the Institute on this, because we really try to take parts that are complex for everybody involved in trying to reduce DNS abuse and reduce that complexity. And one of the ways that we have tried to do that recently is with our centralized abuse reporting tool for phishing, malware, botnets, and spam, which is called NetBeacon. And that is about addressing reports of those issues to the right party quickly and easily to reduce the complexity for law enforcement when they're trying to reach out to the relevant party. So that is one way that I think that we can make good progress on these types of issues.
Thank you. It's a perfect conclusion, actually, for this small portion of the debate, because it's making the distinction between the technical cooperation layer and the legal cooperation layer. The questions of jurisdictions, the question of authority, the question of due process, etc., as Peter has said, is at the moment something that is lacking because of the international lack of cooperation between different authorities and different law enforcement and procedures. At the same time, given the volumes that we're talking about, and it works for also notices about phishing and the rest, anything that can streamline the workflow of fighting the botnets at the level of the evidence, like communicating appropriate validation, having maybe a coordination among a certain number of actors who have the technical expertise to validate the existence and the bona fide of a particular botnet and the domains that are being generated by this algorithm. That is the kind of cooperation that can probably be the first step before contemplating an increased cooperation at the level of the legal operations. So, and thank you, and I'm glad that, Rowena, you had the opportunity to mention indeed what the DNS Abuse Institute is doing, because this idea of having a reporting interface for abuses is one of the elements that can help streamline the circulation of information and the evaluation part. Like in the work of the contact group in the past that you can find in other documents, we had this 4-stage process, like identification, evaluation, decision on action, and recourse. And the identification of the problem relies most often on reputation block lists, on notification by law enforcement, etc. And the more automated the notification can be done, the better we can concentrate afterwards on the cooperation of the legal process and the respect of due process and all the things that go around. We're at 5:59. I'm absolutely, I tried to answer or to bring into the debate the questions that were in the chat. There's one that has not been addressed, and we are staying here for another 15 minutes. If you want, we will stop the recording at the hour. There is one that was asked regarding non-Latin scripts and internationalized domain names. This is an additional level of complexity, I suppose. But I want to thank everyone for having been here, both as participants in the audience and as speakers in the panel. It was a fascinating exercise in the contact group, and I'm extremely happy about the elements that we can contribute to the discussion. Thank you so much. Natalia and Julia, we can close the recording, and we will stay for another 15 minutes if